Okay, in this technique video, I am going to show you how to take a traditional pinch pot and turn it into a pumpkin. Now, some of you might not be choosing a pumpkin as your design, but this video is actually really helpful to understand dimension and to understand both additive and subtractive methods of changing your pinch pot into being something other than just a rounded spherical shape. So a pumpkin, of course, as we're looking at it, I just have this styrofoam pumpkin. It's quite unique. It's not symmetrical, meaning not every piece is the same. And if this were a real pumpkin, of course, it would be sort of lopsided and oftentimes have some texture. But what you're seeing in an actual pumpkin is that it's not just stripes down the side. Oftentimes students will just draw lines and then say, well, it's a pumpkin. But if you're looking at a pumpkin in more detail, you could see that these walls go out and come in, go out and come in, and go out and come in. And they're more just like stripes that kind of come into the center at different points. So that's the technique that we're going to look at today. And even if you're not choosing a pumpkin, these concepts are actually really helpful as you progress in your projects to understand how you might add to your clay or take away from it to create different shapes. So we have a traditional pinch pot here. I just sort of let it set up a little bit. It's soft leather hard, so it's still cool to the touch, but it's lost a little bit of its moisture. So I could kind of like rough it up a little bit and not worry about it sort of falling apart on me. But my goal today is to make this pinch pot look a little bit more like a pumpkin. The way that I'm going to do that is fairly simple. I'm going to take any tool that has a hard edge, so even a dull pencil will do the trick. And I'm going to start to give myself guides of where my pumpkin spines are going to be. So I'm just kind of casually drawing stripes here. They don't need to be perfect because, of course, things in nature are not often perfect. And so now I have just my general guides here. I'm gonna use this one here for our example to kind of show us what it is we're going for. Now what we know is that, as it shows in the example, is that this rib of the pumpkin comes out and goes in. So there's a couple of different ways that we could do that, but I like to use both adding clay and subtracting clay as a technique to make it look more pumpkin-like. Because this is firmed up a little bit and it's not super soft, I am going to use that slip and score method to kind of just make sure the coil that I'm putting on the surface is actually going to stay stuck. So I'm roughing up the surface. Remember, slip and scoring is just the process when you want to attach two pieces of clay. And I'm just going to get the surface wet. This is just going to ensure that the clay that I put on there is ultimately going to stick. I have these kind of casual coils here. They're not perfect because coils or pumpkins aren't perfect, and so there's no really good reason for them to ultimately be exact. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this soft coil on the surface here, and I'm going to compress it on. This is going to attach it to the surface and help keep it on there. I'm putting my other hand in here for leverage. I'm pushing against that as I'm blending this coil on, and you could see I'm just pressing it on, and I'm taking half that coil to the left and half that coil to the right to start to build up this particular wall on my pinch pot. Remember, a pumpkin is going to kind of go out and come in. You could use some other tools like your tongue depressor. If your coil's a little firmer, this is a modeling tool I'm using, and I'm just going to kind of pull some of that clay down and ultimately blend it in to the surface. Again, adding a little bit of water is going to ultimately help me smooth it all out and clean it all up. So now I just have my coil kind of attached onto the surface, and I've started to kind of build up that side of the pumpkin. Now, the center's been built up, which is great, but now where it's supposed to come back down, I actually need to remove clay for it to have that very hard edge that it goes in. So I'm going to use a loop tool, which you can make out of your paper clips and pencil that I gave you. And I'm gonna actually put it on its edge and pull some of that clay out on what's called a bevel. A bevel is just an angle, a softer angle. So I'm pulling some of that out at about a 45-degree angle, and I'm gonna do that towards the rib on this side and then towards the rib on this side. And it doesn't have to be perfect because we're gonna have some time to kind of play around with it and mold it around. But you could see now, as you look on top, that I pulled some of that clay out. Now, what's happening is the wall of the clay is kind of coming up and in and down and looking more pumpkin-like. So now I'm just smoothing out those walls, really kind of detailing out those ribs that a pumpkin has. And you can see here with just a little bit of cleaning up here, we're starting to get the illusion of an actual pumpkin. So if I were to do that one more time on the wall next to it, I could rough up the surface a little bit. Again, this is just to ensure that the clay sticks on it. I'm just gonna wet it up a little bit. I'm gonna take another coil and compressing it on. Now, as long as you're compressing it properly and pushing out any air, you don't need to worry too much about trapping air bubbles. As long as you're pushing it on and getting this coil blended, and ultimately it doesn't end up being too thick. Remember, I could always push my thumb in there and squeeze and kind of thin out that wall a little bit if needed. But you could see with the same process, get it a little bit wet, use some of my tools here, taking some of that coil to the left, some of that coil to the right, and smoothing it out. I'm starting to build up another pumpkin rib, we'll call it. Again, I'm going to take my squared off loop tool and I'm going to pull that clay out, going up into the rib on an angle, because I want that kind of rounded look to it. And then same thing on the other side. I want it to go towards itself. I'm going to soften that up a little bit. Again, you can make one of these loop tools with your paper clip and pencil that I gave you. Or if you've gotten yourself a little ceramic set, that's a really helpful tool to be able to pull away clay. A loop tool simply removes clay, and you could kind of flatten it out or move it around or add texture as you want. But you're starting to see that in a fairly short amount of time, between removing clay and adding clay, you can start to sculpt. So all of this is just simple sculpting techniques that ultimately will take your pinch pot from just a normal circular shape into more of a sculpture. So depending on what it is that you've chosen for your pinch pot, any type of fruit or food or shape might get to the point where you both need to start adding clay to the surface and removing clay. So I'm wanting to flatten this out a little bit. But you could see now that the walls of the pinch pot have started to create some dimension that looks a little bit more pumpkin-like than just simple stripes. As we compare to just drawing lines with no dimension, you could see how a pumpkin would actually come out like a scalloped edge, and it looks way more realistic that the lines are actually created with dimension rather than just a carved line. So you could see that to create a pumpkin, you would add and remove from the surface to detail it out.